All right, this is Dr. Timms again. We're going to go over the second part of this lecture on regulation in the U.S. market. And this is really looking at the structure of that regulation, how it plays out in the particulars of the herbal manufacturing environment. We'll look at both the FDA and the FTC and some of the issues around safety that I think are great opportunities for you to be contributors toward. So, just a reminder, supplements are considered food in many respects. There's no pre-market approval, no mandatory formulation standards, no product registration, no approval of structure function claims, because again, we avoid those structure function claims. Manufacturers are responsible for ensuring safety and compliance. Manufacturers are responsible for reporting safety and adverse events, and the FDA bears the burden of proof for any regulatory action. So they actually have to prove that you're non-compliant. So this is really what the GMPs are set up to do for a manufacturer. It's a comprehensive system of controls for documenting that you've identified your material correctly, that if you discuss or use any kind of concentration or strength, that you can show that. So that might be a herb to hydroalcohol concentration. That might be something as specific as saying that you're going to have certain constituents, say hypericin at 3% in your St. John's wort product. Then you actually have to be able to measure that and show that it's present. That the composition is accurate on the label, that you have accounted for and tested for adulteration as well as contamination, and that you have the paperwork and the documentation of your entire manufacturing processes. So that means when the raw material came in, how it was stored, how the product got made, what methods did you use to identify, measure strength, look at adulterations, etc., etc. So just to note, there are some issues around the dispensatory for our school right now, the GMPs. The formal guidelines are not applied to what the FDA would consider a one-to-one relationship. In other words, a clinician to client is considered a one-to-one relationship. You're not considered a manufacturer. So in the larger scheme of things, our dispensary, since we support the clinicians, we're considered to fall under that. So if you had a dispensary or you had a apothecary in a practice of alternative practitioners, then it would be treated as a non-manufacturing entity. And there you really have to make sure that you have clean environment as cleanliness, that the way you're handling the botanicals, that you make sure that it's that microbial contaminants don't exist, the storage of herbs, the handling of alcohol, instructions for use by clients, educating students and office personnel. So these are all sort of GMPs associated with a dispensary, which is somewhat different than a manufacturer. Now, in our dispensary, if we begin to sell products beyond just students, alumni, and practitioners in the NCC, the Natural Care Center, then we begin to be looked at potentially as a manufacturer, and we would need to be GMP compliant. So companies under this regulation are prohibited from selling a dietary supplement that is toxic or unsanitary. It makes false or unsubstantiated claims. They have claims to cure, treat, or mitigate disease. It's a new dietary supplement ingredient without pre-market notification. So in '94, when DSHEA got enacted, there's an ongoing effort right now on the part of the FDA to say, all right, what herbs were in the marketplace at that time? They will be grandfathered in under DSHEA. Anything that comes in new. So if you are an herb company that have discovered the use of an herb in South America or in Africa that was not part of the marketplace in '94, and you want to begin to bring that in, you have some very different approvals that you have to step through, and these are pre-market notification to the FDA that you have a new dietary ingredient, and you have to have much greater substantiation of the safety of that herb, as well as either evidence-based data or a long use of traditional use of that herb that can point to some form of efficacy. So dietary supplements also can't fail according to the GMP. These are just for the manufacturers. They're not labeled properly or fail to meet label claims. And this is, again, there's this line being drawn, and in fact, coming up in September, it's September 18th, I think there is going to be a meeting at the FDA around this, and the public can attend. Now, GMP enforcement, here's an example of a warning letter to a dietary supplement company demonstrating robust nature of the GMP regulations for enforcement. And I'll let you go through and look at this at your own time. So what I would suggest that you do is, take the time to either come back or pause it now. The 21 CFR and the numbers that follow are the actual statutory elements in the laws that they're actually referring to, where it says you either have to document appropriate tests and examinations, or you have to do something to actually show that your instruments are calibrated, that you use controls. You can go through here, but this is really the type of steps that you have to make sure in your own manufacturing that you're complying. So take your time to look those over. Now, the Federal Trade Commission, or FTC, they look at when you are identifying claims. They consider the ad as the whole, the net impression conveyed by all elements of the ad, including the text, product name, and depictions. So when an ad lends itself to more than one reasonable interpretation, the advertiser is responsible for substantiating each interpretation. So let me show you some examples of what they look like. So example 1, an advertisement claims that university studies prove that a mineral supplement can improve athletic performance. The advertiser has expressly stated that the level of support for the claimed benefit, and is therefore responsible for having university studies that document the advertised benefit. Furthermore, the implied reference to scientific evidence likely conveys to the consumer that the implied claim that the studies are methodologically sound. So they also have to show that as well. So here you can see that there's a nuance to advertising that the FTC is going to pay attention to. Example 2, an advertisement for a vitamin supplement claims that 90% of cardiologists regularly take the product. In addition to the literal claim about the percentages of cardiologists who use the product, the ad likely conveys an implied claim that the product offers some benefit for the heart. Therefore, the advertisers must have adequate support for both representations. And here's a final example. An ad for an herbal supplement makes the claim that the product boosts the immune system to help maintain a healthy nose and throat during the winter season. The ad features the product name, Cold Away, and includes images of people sneezing and coughing. The various elements of the ad, the product name, the depiction of cold sufferers, the reference to nose and throat health during the winter season, all convey to the consumer that the product helps prevent colds. Therefore, the advertisers must be able to substantiate that claim. So they're looking at, again, that sense of the whole message that's being given. Here's a final one. An ad for dietary supplement called ArthroCure claims that the product maintains joint health and mobility into old age. The before picture shows an elderly woman using a walker. The after picture shows her dancing with her husband. The images and product name likely convey implied claims that the product is effective in the treatment of the symptoms of arthritis. It may also imply that the product can cure or mitigate the disease. The advertiser must be able to substantiate these implied claims. So this is where it really makes sense to be very aware of what you're trying to say. This is where you don't get cute with your label. You just keep it simple. So to substantiate claims, the FTC says You have to substantiate before a claim is made, so you have to provide that data. Dose relationships, recognize mechanisms of action, and statistical significance have to be used in this substantiation. And the amount and type of evidence needed to substantiate that claim is based on the nature of the claim. If a claim is purported to be backed by scientific literature, then you have to provide that literature. And it must be scientifically valid studies that can be corroborated. So you're looking at controlled trials, historical use, and publication of claim in peer-reviewed journal. So the other thing that this set up is this tension between the FDA and industry. Now, I will say over the years, and I think there have been some folks that have really worked hard at this in industry, they've looked to be partners and to collaborate with. They want to make the best product out there that they can. The FDA had some good ideas in terms of how that could be done. And so there seems to be a working relationship. And on the part of industry, there's a lot of proactive elements where they encourage member compliance and increase self-policing. So COMFRE is one of those. When pyrrolidine alkaloids began to sort of be recognized as compounds in COMFRE that could cause liver damage in a number of ways, the industry came to the point where they said, either they have to be pyrrolidine-free COMFRE products or only for topical use. And so they actually began to pull those products out of the manufacturing sequence. And so you don't see those products in the market anymore. Also, part of the problem was that the FDA lacked expertise. During my doctoral studies, I was one of the first GIFSAN scholars that worked at FDA, trying to literally provide them expertise on herbal medicine. And you could see that they were very good analytical chemists. They were good microbiologists, but they really didn't understand the complexity of plant material. So they have then developed a number of agreements with labs external to FDA, as well as improving their own internal expertise to help understand the nature of herbals better. But originally, they sort of solved all these problems with a pharmaceutical hammer, right? Analytical chemists and toxicologists. And their focus is on risk-benefit analysis. And so the FDA, the APA, American Herbal Products Association, a trade organization, actually suggested an adverse event reporting mechanism. And this is something that helped identify ephedra. But again, as we mentioned earlier, didn't fully characterize what parts of ephedra and the processing of it and the formulation of it really made it dangerous. That was figured out de facto after it occurred. But still, in the meantime, you've seen manufacturers pull ephedra, and they've pulled COMFRE from the shelves. Now, in the adverse events reports, what's required is that the company whose name is on the label must maintain records of all adverse event reports for 6 years. So a serious adverse event is defined as something that results in death or life-threatening experience, hospitalization, medical or surgical intervention, significant disability, congenital anomaly, or birth defect. So that would be a serious adverse event. Now, this is fairly rare. You'll see reference to a study that looked at the visits to the emergency room associated with dietary supplements. What the authors don't do a good job of is showing you what percentage that is of, the total use, and to really be more clear in pointing out that a good chunk of that, I would say up to 60, almost 70% of that, is based on a small segment of the market. That is young people, children, and older adults taking vitamins and minerals. We all know the horse pills that can come out when you see those products, right, to get the kind of dosing that they require. And literally people were swallowing them and having them get stuck in their throats and leading to potential choking on them. The other is really the market around what I would call the human vanity element, which is sports performance, sexual performance, and weight loss. And this is a ripe area for abuse, and this is where we see an awful lot of it in the marketplace. So you see products coming out of China, herbal products that have adulterated drugs in them. You have, this is where you saw the ephedra mixtures that led to its banning. And so those areas make up a huge chunk of it. So you, literally, in terms of just pure herbal use, you see very few adverse events. The hydroxycut, there were 23 different idiosyncratic hepatotoxicities. This really disappeared after ephedra was removed from the formulation. Actually, no, excuse me. They still occurred after ephedra was removed. And so there was some unknown ingredient that was responsible. And since then, they pulled it from the market. There are some companies like the company that made hydroxycut that are just not scrupulous. So when they couldn't use ephedra, who knows what they put in their place. So these are the adverse events by product category. You can see that herbals, again, very low. Vitamins, combinations, others, multi-products, unknowns. And the most common single product adverse events are Bear One a Day, around 13%, Total Body Formula, Centrum. So you can see all of these are big tablets, and I imagine that a number of those reported adverse events have to do with choking or getting lodged in the throat. Now, the seriousness of dietary supplement adverse events, this is January through October of 2008, so this is an older sample, but this is data that's hard to find, is obviously death is very, very low. Hospitalization, other serious, those tend to be the categories that predominate. Now, I'll point out one other thing, that along with this regulatory element that exists in the marketplace, you had other science organizations that either evolved or strengthened in response to this new regulated marketplace. So the Office of Dietary Supplements at NIH did not exist before DSHEA, but now they are there to fund efforts to develop and validate methods to identify and quantify the biological activity and the adulterants and contaminants. The United States Pharmacopeal Convention, which has been around for a long time, they established what are called compendial standards. These are the monographs that are enforceable by the FDA. And so the monographs are actually used to define products as being misbranded. And finally, the National Institutes of Standards and Technology, what's called NIST, they got involved in a botanical standard reference materials program. So my postdoctoral research was a mixture between NIST and NIH-based funding. And part of what that botanical standard reference material effort was to take an herb, so one of the herbs I worked on, green tea, characterize all the potential actives, how much variation could be found in it, and develop methods that could do a really good job of measuring how much was there, and then apply those to extracts of that product and formulations of that product, so that for a given method, you could define how much variation was expected in the numbers, and then companies, researchers could then use that to identify how well they were doing in terms of measuring the phytochemical constituents of that herb. So it was a way of setting a marker to say, this is something that's been highly characterized. We know the numbers really well, how much variation, and this is a way to measure how good a job you're doing. So this is all sort of what we see in terms of the science generated by some of this regulation. Now I'll stop here. Note that part 3, you're looking around the clinical elements, right? The consumer demand for these, both the products and the clinical practices, questions about licensing, how clinical herbalists are regulated, and the whole idea of informed consent. Okay, thanks. See you soon.